Welcome to All Grown Up Now, a tale of retail, relocation, revenge, reinvention, reckless behavior, really good clothes, indiscretion, infidelity, domestic violence, and one kidnapping. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This podcast is another in a series of installments from a novel I wrote called All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts, available on Amazon.com. It's the story of a small-town boy who dreams of being a grown-up and his journey to get there. Each week, you'll hear another installment of this story. I am pleased to announce that BearWorldMagazine.com will be one of the sponsors of all of the episodes going forward. In the last episode, Ken confronts his family in Kansas and Miss Ann's illness. Episode 18, Springtime for the Fancy Boy. The time, March 1990. The place, Oklahoma City. Mom was sleeping the next morning when I stopped by before going to the airport. Her nurse, a strong, solid blonde lady, gave me a big hug and said that she'd take good care of Mom. I thanked her and left. I got back to San Francisco in the early afternoon and immediately went to bed. I told myself I should have gone to work, but somehow I just didn't feel like doing anything. I immediately fell asleep and slept like a boulder. The phone woke me up after midnight. It was Kathy. She went about 1:30 this morning. It was the first day of spring. In my mind, Mom's passing on the first day of spring was a sign from her, a message saying to go forth like she was going forth into a new season of life. For me, that season was called Springtime for the Fancy Boy. Kathy picked me up from the airport and told me of her last experience with Mom. Ken, they called me at work from the hospital telling me that Mom was crying and asking for me. So I went up and asked her why she was crying. She told me that she was crying because I wasn't married. I asked her if she thought that I wasn't going to be happy because I wasn't married, and she nodded. I told her that Kelly and I were really happy together and that she should have no worries. She told me she loved me, and then she fell asleep. I went back to work and stopped by again on my way home from work. She was still sleeping, so I didn't want to wake her. Ken, she's at the funeral home now and surrounded by flowers. It all looks so beautiful, but it still makes me cry. During the drive, Kathy told me that Lori never went to say her goodbyes. She just pretended that Mom would get better, and her visits to the hospital took just that tone, obliviously chattering on while ignoring the inevitable. That day, Aunt Helen and Uncle Bob and his wife Betty came down from Kansas. Grandma still couldn't ride in the car for very long, and her attitude was, well, she's dead, so what would be the point? It seems the folks in Kansas couldn't rearrange their schedules while she was alive, but they were able to do it for the funeral. There was the public viewing that evening, and at first, I was torn as to whether or not to go. But again, to show the proper respect to Mom and the people who came, I went. Mom was laid out in her favorite gray suit and ivory silk blouse. Coincidentally, the one she wore to my studio party. Her hair was done as she always had it. Amazingly, her hairdresser had gone in and tended to her hair so she would be freshly coiffed as she would have wanted. Her hands were folded in front of her, and her nails were lacquered with her favorite shade of dark red polish. But something was missing. It was her glasses. Kathy brought them later, and Mom was buried wearing them. I had some time alone with her and had a good cry. So this is how it would end. I felt like I had lost her twice in a short period of time. First, losing the illusion I had in therapy, now losing the actual person. Even though I didn't want to go to the viewing, I realized that I needed to. After the viewing, we all ended up back at Mom's house. Neighbors had started bringing food by, lots of cakes and casseroles, which the relatives were tearing into. I didn't feel like talking and went to sit on the stairs to look out the front door. There I was in that haunted house. In the mental state I was in, I could hear all the years of screaming, the slamming and yelling, the fighting, the screeching, all the years of unhappiness. To this day, I can't summon up even one happy memory of that place. But then it was all too loud. Finally, I could take no more of the ghosts, and I went out to sit in the front yard where it was quiet. The limousine picked us up the next morning to take us to the church for the funeral. This was a church we had gone to for a time or two when we first moved to OKC, and lately Mom had been attending. It was one of those dirt gray, concrete brick, Danish modern Methodist churches with fake pipes behind the altar to make believe there was a grand pipe organ. When we walked in, all the other mourners were there. I looked around and saw quite a few of Kathy's friends and one or two people from Mom's place of work. That and the folks from Kansas made up the small group there. This was a stark contrast to Dad's funeral, where it was standing room only. The preacher, who I didn't know, gave the eulogy, if you could call it that. What he said essentially was that he didn't know Ann King, but was just sure she was a nice lady. It seemed that, even though she attended the church, fear prevented her from interacting with the other parishioners. She came, listened, and went home without talking to or being talked to by any of the other parishioners. The burial was to be in Kansas, next to Dad. There would be a graveside service there as well for those who didn't come to OKC for the funeral. After the funeral, we drove up to Kansas and landed at Grandma's. Once there was a discussion as to whether there would be an open casket at this service. It was closed at the funeral. Lori, of course, was for the open casket. It would afford her a dramatic opportunity denied her at the funeral to publicly and dramatically show her grief. Kathy and I, however, were against it. I thought it barbaric, especially at the graveside service, to have people who hadn't laid eyes on Mom in years, in some cases decades, gawping at her now. My reasoning was that there was a time and there was a place where if you wanted to pay your respects, they could have done so. Grandma was in such a state about this that she refused to go to the service. Her excuse? She didn't want to get out on the ice and snow as she might fall and break a hip or something. Other family members supplied the expected response, "Oh, that's okay, I understand." After the graveside service, Uncle Bob hosted a gathering at his big new house at the edge of town. Grandma, of course, was there, braving the very same ice and snow. Apparently, she was no longer worried about slipping and falling. She was standing next to me in line at the buffet when she turned and asked me the question, "How did she look?" This immediately infuriated me. Now, as an aside, if you want to clear a room after a funeral, this is what you say. I turned to her, fixed her with my eyes that welled steel, and said loudly, "She looked dead." All movement in the room stopped, and Grandma turned white. I moved in for the kill. She didn't look like she was sleeping. She didn't look peaceful. She died of cancer. She looked dead. I looked around, and everyone had vanished like cockroaches when you turn on the light, except for Grandma, who stood rooted to the spot with a look of complete horror on her face. For the rest of the evening, nobody would get within 15 feet of me. The next morning at Grandma's house, it sounded more like a party than the aftermath of a funeral. All the family was going through old family albums, laughing, and commenting on how they should all do this more often. Grandma started grilling us on who was left what in the will, another family tradition. Usually the will was brought out at times like these, so everybody would know what their take would be. I announced that we hadn't read the will yet because we were still grieving, and really it was none of their business, and for sure none of them were going to get anything anyway. Kathy wanted to go to the grave, but I didn't. Somehow, I was still stewing in the anger that everyone else seemed to be having such a good time and I wasn't, so I declined. This was my one regret. Years later, when I was in Topeka on a gig, I drove over to put flowers on their grave, and this was the first time I had seen it since years before, when I visited on a trip back to Salina while Mom was still alive. Back in Oklahoma City, we began the task of sorting through the house, which Kathy stood to inherit. Mom had said many times that she wanted Kathy to get the house, and God knows Kathy earned it. She was Mom's handler for the last 10 years and was primarily responsible for maintaining the place because Mom wasn't suited for hard manual labor. Happily, everyone, including Lori, behaved themselves, and there were none of the ugly squabbles that sometimes erupt when breaking up an estate. We all went through the house to decide who would get what would be sent to charity, and what would be sold. Kathy made arrangements for an estate sale for the stuff that nobody wanted. In this pile included all of those wedding gifts that Mom had got when she married Don. With all that taken care of, I flew back to San Francisco and back to therapy. The rest of that year was taken up with work, therapy, more work, and more therapy. I finally came to peace with Mom, realizing that she was, indeed, crazy, but not stupid, and more importantly, she wasn't a monster all the time. She was just human. There was a certain liberation I felt when I got to the point where I forgave her. I realized, starting with what I observed when Mom was dying, that she did the best she could. Miss Ann was operating from a position of fear and anger her entire life, and this came from being raised in a situation where she never felt safe or loved. I got to see this clearly by how her family behaved. Consequently, she couldn't provide that feeling of safety and love for us simply because she had no experience of it. But she did the best she could. She did the best she could, and, as a result, she didn't do too badly. Mom taught me how to work hard, how to spend judiciously, and, by serving as a negative example, how not to get taken advantage of. I came out okay, and in a strange sort of way, my upbringing is my source of strength. It gave me a certain sense of the absurd and made me tough and gave me the knowledge that whenever I got knocked down, I would always have the strength to get back up, dust myself off, and move on. Another thing Mom did before she died was to give me to Norma. Norma told me about this a few weeks later. I knew that she had called Mom in the hospital because I asked her to. We talked for over an hour, Norma said. She talked about being scared and angry her whole life and asked if this was the result, that it was eating her insides out. I didn't answer her. I think she already knew what the answer was. Then she said, "Norma, he's your son now. Take care of him for me." And I said that I would. Mom is now in a place where there is indeed no anger or fear, and my wish for her is that she enjoys and truly owns and experiences it, just as I am enjoying the freedom and responsibility of leaving the past behind and being an adult. After dealing with the estate issues after Mom's death, I returned to San Francisco to take up life again. When I arrived back home, there was a message on my answering machine from Susan. "Darling Angel, we need to go to Max's Opera Plaza and have a big fat dessert. You need it, and I have something to celebrate," she said. So, one Saturday evening before going to the Opera House, Susan and I settled into a banquette at Max's and ordered up something big, fattening, and chocolate. Then she turned and looked at me. "So, what are we celebrating?" I asked. "Darling Angel, I don't have lung cancer." I guess Susan saw that I might have gone pale. I was certainly feeling a bit wobbly. So she quickly said, "I know what you've just gone through with your mother and all, and I didn't want to say anything before. But I got the news a few days ago that this was all a false alarm." "Well, thank God that it was," I exclaimed. "Let's look forward to years of good health for you." We sat there a few moments, quiet. "You know, darling Angel, dying isn't something I'm really afraid of," Susan continued. "Because if I had to go tomorrow, I can truly say, wasn't it all great? I've done everything I wanted to, been to many of the places I had hoped to travel to, and even played Lady Capulet on the stage of the Opera House, quite well, I might add. If I went tomorrow, I wouldn't have any regrets." This hit me like a ton of bricks. Susan had a wonderful life, to be sure, which she fearlessly created. She had more than her share of troubles, health-wise and otherwise. I had seen her through some of these issues over the years and watched how she always ended up back on her feet with her delightful outlook intact. Susan lived through all of the bad times, but chose to embrace the good times, which she actively sought by being such an adventurous spirit. I contrasted that with Mom, who was too scared to live and, then on her deathbed, was too scared to die. Seeing these two examples in such rapid succession made a real impression on me. I decided, when I go, I want to go like Susan. It was a celebration of life that evening. The following Sunday, I went to church at Amron and discovered that Philippe was there, along with Matt, of all people. Fuck me. At first, I wanted to leave. I was so furious. But I stayed as it was my church, and I would be damned if I'd let him run me out of it. I sought out Norma to say something like, "Can you fucking believe this?" She told me that he had been there the week before and had asked after me. When she told him that I was dealing with Mom's death, he said that he wished he'd known he could have comforted me. I told him that he has friends to do that, so he doesn't need you, she said. During the service, I got to sit next to JT. JT was a corn-fed blonde hunk from Nebraska, big, beefy, and beautiful. Someone had clued him into what was going on with Matt and Philippe, so he put his arm around my shoulders and led me to the front of the room. "You sit next to me," he grinned. And he sat there through the whole service with his arm around me, giving Matt dirty looks. I wanted to turn to Matt and say, "Yeah, yeah, yeah," but I restrained myself. After the service, Matt tried to engage me in conversation, but I didn't respond. I just walked out. At home, I sent him a short note telling him that I couldn't stop him from going there, it was a public place, but to leave me alone. He was part of my past, and that's where he needed to stay. The letter I got back was quite a doozy. The only thing I really remember from the letter was him saying something like, You have to get to a place where you can accept me as your friend before you can dismiss me from your life. Needless to say, this was fodder for therapy. When I read the letter to Dennis, he asked me what I thought. Well, when I was with him, he talked that way a lot. I just thought that with an IQ of 140, he was talking over my head. What do you think now? Dennis asked. Well, now I think it's bullshit. Why would I dismiss someone who I've accepted as a friend? I replied. Exactly, he said. Now, what do you want to do? I want to tell him how I feel. So that was my therapy homework. So I wrote another letter. In it, I said, Matt, I said you are a part of my past and need to stay there. No reply was requested, so again, I will state for clarity. You are part of my past and you need to stay there. Leave me alone, don't contact me, or talk to me if you see me. No reply is requested, just in case you're not sure. Later, I heard through members of the church that Philippe was threatened with deportation because he didn't have a green card. Matt had the idea that a successful businessman who went to Amron, that would be me, could sponsor Philippe for a green card and then he could stay. He kept asking around and asking around. Perhaps they knew of someone? Anyone? Anyone? Indeed, I never heard how that turned out. Now, as for Matt's family, they all still liked me. They all said I made them feel welcome in my home, so we've kept in touch over the years. That's how I learned that Matt eventually moved to LA and became a dial-a psychic for one of those 976 numbers we were seeing in advertisements around that time. This job came to an unceremonious and abrupt end when Matt went to work one day, found the doors padlocked, and the furniture gone. Uh-oh. He must not have been a very good psychic. So he and Philippe moved to Palm Springs, where the career trajectory of a dial-a psychic leads to body worker, more commonly known as massage therapy. When Joseph, Matt's brother, and George started the process to become Joseph and Georgette, I was the first one they called. George was going to become Georgette. What did I think of that? My response was something like, well, duh. I remember I always referred to George as my sister-in-law. Now it was going to be made official. There was a flurry of phone calls to me from the family after this news hit the wires. Sister Frances called one day, all in a state, asking me what I thought of the whole thing. Now I've heard from all of you. Damn it, Frances, you're divorced. Your sister Mary's divorced. Your brother Tom's divorced. Your brother Matt's divorced twice. Your sister Rebecca's divorced. Joseph and Georgette have been together 28 years. I think they know something we don't know, so we should just wish them well and get the fuck over it. So, tell everyone else in the family just that. Georgette made the transition, and she and Joseph married. I have their wedding photo. Georgette made a beautiful bride. They've been together now about 40 years, and both are very, very happy. A little prologue here. Georgette still likes to call with the latest gossip, and this is what led to the phone call recently, telling me of Matt's new paramour and Philippe's disposal. Matt had given up the dial-a psychic work and embraced the body work, as I said. Again, this is the career trajectory of a dial-a psychic. What I learned was that he was working for a posh spa in Southern California, and that's where he met the woman. Then he wasn't working at the posh spa and was with the woman. Coincidence? I don't think so. My response was, well, Georgette, when he left me for another man. What did Philippe do to put him off men? I guess this is what they call the dial-a psychic retirement plan. Georgette told me that Philippe was surprised by all of this and was hurt that he got ditched for somebody else. My question was, did he think he was special? Wasn't he paying attention? After all, I was in the next room. I so wanted to be catty and actually call Philippe to ask what he did that put Matt off men. But actually, I know what that was. Matt could always spot a sucker of either gender. Instead, I told Georgette to thank Philippe for me. He was my excuse to take that monkey off my back, which freed me to move onward and upward. Onward and upward was where I wanted to go that year. One thing I undertook was studying French couture pattern making. I studied with a woman named Simone who had studied at the École Guerlain in Paris. Between therapy, running a business, and studying, that year just flew by. Before I knew it, it was the holidays. Dad died December 30th, 1968. On the anniversary of his death, through a chain of circumstances that year, I found myself at a seance led by Norma at Amron. Someone had canceled at the last minute, so she called and asked me to be a guest. I had no agenda in going, really, as it was all so unexpected. Norma was channeling an entity who was saying to me that I would be successful and blah, 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 which I was only half listening to. Then she said, "This isn't what you came here for. There's someone you want to contact. Who is it?" "My father," I said. It came out unexpectedly, as he wasn't a presence in my life and not really an issue. Norma had some trouble bringing him forward, as he was somewhat reluctant, but eventually there he was. "Do you have any questions for me?" he asked. "Yeah." "Did you die just to get away from Mom?" It was a joke I still use. He had had enough, so he just died. It was easier than divorcing Miss Ann. "Yes, I did," was the answer. Then there tumbled out the story of his childhood and his marriage with Mom. Gertie, his mother, it seems, went crazy when she almost died in childbirth and beat Dad mercilessly when he was a child. Grandpa was too weak to do anything about it, so he just let her go. This damaged Dad's spirit, which is why he made the choices he did. While he was speaking, I saw in front of me a photo of Gertie that I remember from our family album, and, next to it, one I have of Mom in high school. The similarity of appearance is something I never noticed before. Dad had married his mother. It was a match made, if not in heaven, in Freud's office. He had a weak father who worked in his workshop to hide out from his wife, and a mother who wore the pants in the family. Mom also came from a weak father who worked in his workshop to hide out from his wife, and a mother who wore the pants in the family. Dad had a workshop to hide out in when he wasn't traveling, and Mom wore the pants. So you see, Ken, I couldn't take it anymore. Imagine the hell she put you through, but then imagine being a grown-up man who wasn't strong enough to fight back, he said. "But why around Christmas?" I asked. "You know, your timing really sucked." "I know, but I had to go," he said. "It was time, and I had to go. I thought she was angry with me, so if I went, she would be easier on you, but I was wrong. For that, I'm sorry. Please don't be mad at me." Then he was gone. I was really stunned by this. It made all the bits and pieces make sense. The scrapbooks that Gertie made, filled with his drawings saying, "I love you, Mommy, I love you, Mommy, I love you, Mommy," screaming all over them, seeming to plead something deeper like, "Don't beat me, Mommy, don't beat me, Mommy." The mouse of a father as a role model, the change of direction after the war, the drinking problem nobody talked about, it all made sense that he would repeat the pattern with a woman who looked like his mother and, more importantly, behaved like her. To say I was blown back would not put too fine a point on it. It took me some time to digest this. Strangely, I felt Dad's presence all around me the next day. That evening, when I was sitting in bed, I decided to talk to him. "Dad, you know, I'm not mad at you. Everything worked out okay in the end. I ended up okay. If you hadn't died, my life would be extremely different now, and I can't imagine that I would be happy living in Salina, being an electrical engineer, and running your business. Besides, you said you were sorry. Somehow, in the vast scheme of things, that is what I wanted to hear from someone in the situation, and it satisfies something deep inside. So, Dad, no, I'm not angry with you. Go with God. There's something liberating about not being angry with one's parents anymore. Mom's death helped me confront my issues with her and come to some resolution about her and her particular situation. Even though I didn't realize it, I needed this resolution with Dad and was fortunate enough to have the experience I did. When it is all said and done, they did the best they could with the information and upbringings they had. It wasn't ideal, they weren't ideal, but I'm not perfect either. I did turn out pretty well, all things considered. The one thing that was hard to put into words was this experience for the first time in my life made me feel, for lack of any better way to phrase it, more male. Until then, I didn't feel a connection with Dad and that whole energy, and after the seance, I did. It was only in retrospect that I realized what I had missed, that connection with the male half of the equation that was my parents. It was only after this experience that I recognized that I had more in common with Dad than with Mom. Dad was the world traveler. Dad started his own business. Dad had all the friends. Dad was college educated. Dad was the one who left his hometown to strike out on his own. And strangely, as time goes by, I look more like him and less like Mom. Sometimes therapy needs some helping hands from other planes or places. I know one therapist and his client who are grateful for that help. In the next episode, we'll get to know my father. His name is Wilbur Dean King, and we'll give a little more about his story. Thanks for listening. I'd like to thank BearWorldMagazine.com for sponsoring this podcast. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play. If you have questions, you can reach me through the website, allgrownupnow.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Kenneth D. King, on Facebook at Kenneth D. King Design, or on my main website, KennethDKing.com.